Mute. Just going to wait for a few more people to log in. Great. So good evening, everyone from around the world. And it truly is an international presence we have here tonight. Welcome on behalf of the Cape South African Jewish Board of Deputy to this evening's webinar entitled Navigating Online Hate and Anti-Semitism. My name is Daniel Bloch. I'm the new Executive Director of the Board of Deputies in Cape Town. And as you may or may not know, the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, we represent the Western Cape Jewish community. We do aim to protect the civil rights of our community and securing an environment where all Jews in the community can express themselves, observe their Judaism. We also try to educate our external audiences about their religion, and we firmly stand against anti-Semitism and all acts of hatred. I think what's relevant for this particular webinar tonight is since May the 10th, when the conflict in the Middle East broke out, things flared up again. The 6 to 8 weeks thereafter, the Jewish community globally suffered probably the worst case of online anti-Semitism to date. Individuals on social media were being targeted simply for their affiliation to Israel, or being Jewish, and businesses were being called to be boycotted globally. So to date, we've also seen quite a sharp increase in other forms of online hate speech, such as gender-based violence, xenophobia, issues towards the LGBTQ community as well. So tonight, with our fantastic lineup of speakers, we hope to look at what some of the legal options are around online anti-Semitism and hate speech, and to hear from around the world, from the US, from the UK, and from South Africa, as to what has been happening over the last couple of months. I think it's important to welcome our speakers. We'll get a bit of an update on who everyone is, but firstly to Emma Sadleir, Wendy Kahn, Daniel Sugarman, and Dave Sifry, who will be joining us. You may notice there's a slight change from the advert. Daniel Kelley from ADL in the US was scheduled to be with us. Unfortunately, he cannot make it, but fortunately it's because he's expecting the birth of his child. So we wish him mazel tov and all the best, and welcome Dave Sifry in his place. Just a few house rules before we get cracking, because I know you haven't tuned in to listen to me talk. Emma Sadleir is going to kick off as our keynote speaker. She's going to look at and outline the legal aspects associated with online hate. She's going to look at what you can and can't do, as well as take some questions. So we do encourage everybody to ask as many questions as possible. Unfortunately, Emma's going to need to leave probably in the next half an hour or so, because she's also a proud new mom, having recently given birth. And I think, Emma, if I'm not mistaken, parental duties are going to start quite soon as well. So we're on a bit of a baby time limit. But once Emma has completed her presentation, she's taken some questions from the audience, then we'll move on to our panel discussion, where we will get an insight into what has happened with the conflict of the last few months from the UK, from the US, and from South Africa. So please, there's the questions and answers button at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to ask as many questions as you can. If that doesn't work for you, then there's a chat function as well. You can send questions there, and our panel of speakers will endeavor to answer as many of these questions as possible. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the moderator for this evening, Simone Salkis, who's a member of the Cape South African Jewish Board of Deputies, and she's also the chairperson of our Anti-Semitism and Legal Subcommittee. So everybody, please enjoy, ask lots of questions, and we look forward to sharing some more insight with you. Simone, over to you.
Afternoon, everybody. So just to introduce Emma Sadleir, our keynote speaker. She's one of South Africa's leading experts on social media law. The company she founded, the Digital Law Company, specializes in educating and advising corporates, employees, schools, and universities on the legal, disciplinary, and reputational risks of social media. Emma's expertise includes managing the legal consequences of using social media, including defamation, privacy, hate speech, cyberbullying, and harassment. Please feel free to post any questions for Emma in the chat box, and she'll try and get to them. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Simon, and it's lovely to see the faces that I can see, the faces I can't see. It's nice to think that you're inside my computer, and thank you for dialing in. I'm sorry that I can't be here for the whole time. I've got to go and bath babies and put them to bed, but I am thrilled to be speaking to you. I am sorry that it's an issue that we have to address, because I have been completely blown away in the course of my professional career, really, by the kinds of hate that we see online, the online harms, the online hurtful, harmful, prejudicial expression that we see. I deal a lot with kids and the kinds of issues that kids are dealing with, cyberbullying, harassment, and I deal with a lot of defamation and privacy law. So that's kind of my background. I'm no longer a practicing attorney. I run a legal consultancy in Joburg, and I give a lot of talks, a lot of educational work, because it really is one of those places that education is better, prevention is better than cure. And I think the best way to prevent us, our employees, our children messing up is by education. So we've got a very limited topic as far as I'm concerned, and that is, how do we react to online hate? How do we react to cancel culture, anti-Semitism, negative reviews on social media, some founded, sometimes unfounded. When we're talking about business reviews, I was contacted by many members of the Jewish community. A few months ago, some were targeted in their personal capacities because they may have put an overlay of "I stand with Israel" or a flag, an Israeli flag, on their profile pictures on Facebook. I was contacted by people to say that their businesses were suffering from online hate campaigns, online campaigns of defamation and harassment, calling for boycotts, etc. And what do we do? And we're going to talk about some of the practical implications in terms of taking any legal steps. Obviously, when you're dealing with an online crisis, whether it's a cancel culture type thing, or whether there's just a campaign of hate, harassment, defamation that people have embarked on against you, there are legal options. The primary legal options that we deal with are defamation, harassment, criminal, and there's a new crime under the Cyber Crimes Act. So I'll talk about all of those in a bit more detail. There are reputational responses, which is a factual correction that somebody has maybe said something that's totally inaccurate about your business or about you personally, and you publish a statement explaining that what they've said is untrue, or answering the allegations. Sometimes I think content calls for a reputational response. Sometimes I think content calls for a legal response. Very often, I think content calls for no response, and that's a very difficult pill to swallow, because the effect often of taking legal action is that we add fuel to the fire. And even if it's a protection order under the Harassment Act, what we see happening is that people, then it's operative against you, and in theory the protection order extends to you not getting any of your cronies to do the harassment on your behalf, but it's very difficult to control that. So what happens with these digital vigilante mobs is that one person maybe has a protection order against them, they get the few thousand other people to jump on the bandwagon, and often you land up suffering more, your privacy and dignity. So let's quickly start right at the beginning. Everyone has the right to the right to freedom of expression, Section 16 of our Constitution in South Africa, an absolutely imperative right. I think actually I would go so far as to say it's the cornerstone of our democracy. But what people don't understand is that it's not an absolute right. I do think that I just want to say that exercising your right to freedom of expression in putting a flag on your profile picture, that's an absolutely valid right to your freedom of expression. Exercising of your right to freedom of expression. It doesn't mean you can't be criticized. Where we start getting outside of the bounds of what's lawful and what's unlawful is where it unlawfully infringes on your right to privacy, your right to dignity, your right to reputation, which is encompassed in the right to dignity, your right to equality, your right to religion, right? So the whole thing is a balancing act. Where does my right to freedom of expression begin and end? And I remember a professor years ago at university explaining to me that the right to freedom of expression is like having the right to wave your hand wherever you want to, and your fist wherever you want to, and that right ends where somebody else's nose begins. You know, it is it's a very nuanced balancing act between where do we draw the line between what I'm allowed to say and protecting other people's rights. So I'm going to share some slides, and as was mentioned, you can ask questions as we go. Somebody will read them to me and interrupt me if needed. I am happy to answer any questions as we go. I've got a very short time slot, so I might zoom through some of this. Excuse the pun. But I do want to just quickly talk about some of the laws. Okay, so legal options. If you are the victim of prejudicial online content. First is defamation. In order to sue somebody for defamation, you just have to show three things. That content was published to one other person. Now, what that means is that there is no difference in the way that the law treats content published on the front page of the newspaper and content published on a WhatsApp group to 3 people. As soon as content has been seen by one other person, then in the eyes of the law, we treat that content as if you published it on the front page of the newspaper, and all the same laws apply. So the 3 requirements for defamation: it must be published to one other person, it must refer to you directly or indirectly. Now, what we see often when people are causing hate online is that we saw sort of a subtweeting culture. So everybody knows they're talking about me, but they don't name me, because then they know that that could really lead them to some big, serious legal trouble. But what the law says is it doesn't matter whether the reference to the victim is direct or indirect. So if somebody writes an article about the blonde social media lawyer in South Africa, or if somebody writes an article about Emma Sadleir, they're still referring to me. That requirement of reference is met as soon as somebody can be identified, even if it's by a handful of people. And the third thing is that it must lower your reputation in the eyes of the ordinary thinking third party. It must hurt your reputation, right? Any allegations that you've been unethical, you've behaved in an illegal way, hypocritical, fraudulent, I mean, anything that makes you look bad in the public's eyes would constitute that part of the defamation. So where we see a lot of that coming in is perhaps you've, I don't know, you've made a declaration that you stand with Israel. And then somebody goes onto LinkedIn and finds out very swiftly which company you work for, or your own company's name, or if you're a, I don't know, a doctor in private practice. And then they go onto a website like Hello Peter, and they create a completely fabricated review of your business, right? That would be defamation. It refers to you or your business, because businesses can sue for defamation. It's published to one other person. As I said, it doesn't matter whether it's one person or a million people, and it hurts your reputation. You could sue that person. The law then says that it falls on the person who's published, who's named and shamed, to prove that what they're saying is both true and for the benefit of the public. Now, in some countries, as long as they can show truth, then they're fine, it's defensible. But in South Africa, we have truth plus public and benefit, which is quite important in the sort of intrafamilial disputes, because if you go on a rant about your loser ex-boyfriend and how he's frolicking around town with his new floozy, the courts are saying, I've got no doubt it's true, but it's not for the benefit of the public. You airing your dirty laundry is not for the benefit of the public. So that's quite an important thing to bear in mind. In order to defend a defamation action in South Africa, you have to show that what you're saying is true and for the benefit of the public. Now, if somebody has written some kind of review to say that you are responsible for a genocide because, you know the kind of leaps that I'm talking about, where people, because you say you stand with Israel and then people call you a murderer, they would have to prove that what they're saying is true. So that's defamation. There are various nuances we need to talk about how you get to court, how long it takes, etc. I'm going to take you through one example about how I think we should behave in a defamation action. The second in South Africa is a relatively new law, and it's called the Protection from Harassment Act. It's a very, very powerful and very quick, very easy, very cheap mechanism to get somebody to stop, right? If you're being harassed, threatened, stalked, you can go off to the magistrate's court. You get given a standard form. You can even print it off from the internet before you get there. You fill in your details. You fill in the details of the person who's harassing you. You give them a very short paragraph about what the harassment constitutes. And provided there's a sort of a prima facie case that you are being harassed, the court will issue what they call an interim protection order. Now, there is a mechanism for you to use the Protection from Harassment Act against anonymous accounts. The court will issue what they call a directive to investigate. So then you get this piece of paper and then the police must use all their resources to try and find out who's behind the harassment. If you know who the harasser is, you get that protection order, the interim order. It's operative immediately. It needs to be served on that person. And then you all go back to court on a return day, which is a few weeks later, sometimes a few months, depending on the backlog. And then if you can convince the court that you have been harassed, that protection order will be made sort of permanent and it lasts for 5 years. Now, if that person who's been harassing you so much as sends you an SMS during that time, they can be arrested. You have to show that there's harm or a fear of harm, but it can be mental, emotional, psychological harm. So it's squarely cyberbullying, this. It can be physical harm or a fear of physical harm. Somebody's threatening to hurt you. It can be financial harm, somebody calling for a boycott of you or your business. It only operates against an individual, though. So in order for you to get a protection order, your company can't go off and get a protection order. That's got to be an individual within the company who has to show that they themselves have been harassed. Now, of course, the law in theory and the law in practice in South Africa are totally different beasts. The idea that you can go off and get this protection order and it's a magic wand is a lovely idea. And in some instances, I've had clients phone me and sometimes lawyers phone me and say, if only I'd known about this, it's the same as a High Court interdict. We got it the same day. We didn't have to brief senior counsel. We didn't even need a lawyer. We got off and we got this thing. And it's been immediate and wow, it's amazing. And then there's some where it's just a complete nightmare and it's completely ineffective. And I see Wendy nodding because she's got experience of this. And it's a nightmare. But I can tell you that on occasion, it is incredibly useful and incredibly successful. Crimininjuria is where you go and lay a criminal charge at the police station. And crimininjuria simply means that somebody has seriously infringed your dignity. South African Jewish Board of Deputies had a great success. I'm sure you all know about it, with Swallow, who said the Holocaust will be like a picnic when I'm done with all you Zionist bastards. And the court found that to be crimininjuria. It was a great victory in terms of anti-Semitism. And we're seeing crimininjuria used in all sorts of platforms. We see it used in racism cases, homophobia cases, sexism cases. Vicki Mumberg was the famous one in South Africa who used the K word not once, not twice, but 48 times. She didn't put it on social media, but somebody recorded it. It was a phone call that was distributed, and she was sentenced to prison. Adam Katsavolis, same thing. So crimininjuria can be very, very useful. It can be a good threat. It can be a big stick to say to somebody, look, unless you stop, I'm going to go and lay criminal charges against you. And we have got cyberbullying cases. I'm thinking of Joyce Malamu and Oyanda Mbuli. So Oyanda Mbuli is a very famous businesswoman in South Africa, and she posted on Facebook. Joyce Malamu posted on Facebook. Could somebody please find Oyanda Mbuli a blesser so she stops phoning my boyfriend asking him for money, posted Oyanda Mbuli's cell phone number, and then also called her a B, word beginning with B and ending in itch. And she laid 2 charges, she deleted it very quickly. She laid 2 charges of crimininjuria against her. Oyanda Mbuli did. And the court prosecuted it and found her guilty. Now, in that instance, she didn't have to spend any money on lawyers. You know, the NPA did their job. They prosecuted. It was a successful prosecution. The sentence was a 6,000 Rand fine, 350 hours of community, or a suspended prison sentence, 350 hours of community service. She had to do an 8-week adult life skills program through NICRA, program for adulting, who knew? And worse than that is that she had a criminal record for a Facebook post that she posted in the heat of the moment and deleted very quickly. So it can be useful. I find crimininjuria an incredibly useful crime. Of course, it's only as useful as the police, the hands of the police and the prosecutors it lands in. But could be an option. Hate speech. very much in the news at the moment because last week the Constitutional Court handed down a judgment. It's a judgment that we've been waiting for a long time. It was a case, John Kolani, who's now died. It was 13 years ago, this article that he published, and he said, "Call me names, but gay is not okay." And then compared homosexuality to bestiality. I mean, the most horrific article. And there was a record number of complaints for hate speech to the Human Rights Commission, and he was eventually taken to the Equality Court after years and years of stalling. And then Kolani appealed to the Supreme Court of Appeal, basically saying that the definition of hate speech was too broad. So the definition of hate speech up until last week in South Africa under the Equality Act was speech which is hurtful, harmful, or incites violence. I say all. We never knew whether that was an and or an or. And basically what the court said is that hurtful is not sufficient, right? It needs to be quite a lot more than hurtful. And they have given us some new wording, which I've got on the screen now. The new definition, pending, because it's now for 2 years, Parliament has for 2 years to update the legislation to make it now constitutionally compliant. But no person may publish, propagate, advocate, or communicate words that are based on one or more of the prohibited grounds, of course religion being one of them, against any person that could reasonably be construed to demonstrate a clear intention to be harmful or to incite harm and to promote or propagate hatred. So there has to be this element to promote or to propagate hatred. It can't just be hurtful on its own, harmful on its own. It has to include this extra element of to promote or propagate hatred. And then without prejudice to any remedies of a civil nature, any case dealing with the publication, advocacy, propagation, or communication of hate speech is contemplated to the Director of Public Prosecutions having jurisdiction for the institution of criminal proceedings in terms of the common law or relevant legislation. Now, they didn't mess it up. That was what was important. It was a unanimous judgment, and it. I think that that it's not a terrible outcome. They certainly found that the article itself was hate speech, and it certainly was, and I'd say a victory for the LGBTIQ community in South Africa. But hate speech, Human Rights Commission, we know that hate speech is in the process of being criminalized. At the moment, you can take somebody to the Equality Court or lay a complaint at the Human Rights Commission. And then I've just thrown in here the Cyber Crimes Act, which I've got an extract of because this is brand spanking new. It's not yet 100% effective. It's one of those pieces of law that's in a sort of a twilight zone because it's been passed, it's been signed into law by President Ramaphosa, which was a couple of weeks ago. But we are waiting for somebody to declare the effective date, a promulgation date. But it is a step in the right direction from my point of view. It's got a criminalization of revenge pornography or image-based violence, which is what I deal with a lot. So I'm excited about this becoming proper law, although obviously they could have done a lot better. But this is the section that I think may be useful in terms of trying to combat anti-Semitism and hate speech against the Jewish community. The first is a data message which incites damage to property or incites violence. Any person who sends a message inciting damage to property or inciting violence is guilty of a criminal offense. That could be to a person or it can be to a group of persons, for example, the Jewish community. The second section, which I think is relevant, is section 15, which says that a person commits an offense if they send a message, online message, doesn't matter how it's sent, whether it's social media, direct message, etc., that threatens a person with damage to property or threatens that person or a group of persons with violence. And so that's a great new law. It won't apply if somebody says it to you, but as soon as it happens electronically, the Cyber Crimes Act criminalizes it. I did just throw this in because, you know, we see a lot of fake news. And just before we came live this evening, we were talking about fake news and anti-vaxxers, and we were talking about how there's, you know, whenever there are conspiracy theories often breed hate. I do want to say that there is a very limited criminalization of fake news in South Africa. It's not general at all. It requires two things. You have to show that the person published that fake news with the intention to deceive. And the second thing is that it has to be about COVID. So any fake news about 5G towers, it's not criminalized, but fake news about COVID, cures to COVID, that kind of thing, that person can be arrested and charged with a criminal offense, and we have seen it. So those are the main responses. What I want to do now is just talk about how do we deal with this practically. I don't know if there are any questions, just unmute yourself and shout if they have, because
Hi, Emma. Yeah, definitely some questions coming through.
Cool.
The first one being under the Equality Act, we obviously see that it says incite harm or harmful. How does the courts interpret this differently to the Cybercrimes Act, where it talks about inciting violence? So how is it inciting harm versus inciting violence practically with cases?
So one is about inciting violence, the other one is harm, and the definition of harm is mental, emotional, psychological harm. So I think that the intention of the Cybercrimes Act, and we're not sure because it's brand new, so we need to see how it's actually going to be applied. At the moment, it's kind of principles-based. But when it comes to harm, the definition of harm in the Protection from Harassment Act and the definition of harm in the Equality Act, we're dealing with emotional, psychological, mental harm. So where we're dealing with cyberbullying, hate speech, harm speech, like speech which causes harm to dignity rather than to the person, the well-being of the person, it would be certainly covered. Anything else?
Great, thank you. I think I have a question more just personally though, in terms of with hurtful, the term hurtful. So in the Kelley judgment, we obviously know that the court found that the term hurtful was too vague to keep. When we're talking about harm though, and we're saying, you know, there's this emotional harm, that's quite a subjective feeling. So how do we remedy that with hurtful being too vague, too subjective versus an emotional harm? What would those requirements look like?
Yeah, look, it's such a tricky one because hurtful, if somebody calls me a fat pig, like that could be hurtful, but it's just kind of baseless abuse, right? So it is a very, very difficult one. Where do we draw that line between kind of baseless abuse, like, oh yeah, it's hurtful to say something mean about me, but the actual harm that needs to be committed. So I quite like the definition and the way that the Protection from Harassment Act deals with this concept of harm. This idea that there has to be harm or a fear of harm, but as I said, it can be mental, emotional, psychological harm. If somebody just says something to you that really is just like words, that's not harm. But if somebody says something to you, and when I'm teaching the kids, I say, it's so horrible, it hurts your insides, you know, when I'm trying to explain what dignity is. And it's a very, very difficult principle, really, because it's one of those, like, once you've experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, I mean, as I say, each case has to be determined on its own, on its own merits. But I do think that I do like that, you know, the mental, emotional, psychological harm is recognized harm.
We also have a question from Gary, who wants to know, with regards to causing emotional, psychological harm, how would you prove intent of it?
So that's interesting, because the Kelley judgment talks about it doesn't matter what the subjective intent of that person was. If objectively it causes harm, emotional, psychological harm, then it causes harm. So we actually take the subjective element out of it on the basis of the new Kelley judgment. As I say, it's days old, so we still need to try and get to grips with what it's actually going to mean for everybody. But yeah, I'd say that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you. And I know you said you're going to touch on the actual enforcement mechanism for these different rights now. We do have some questions in that regard. Should I let you continue and I'll ask you after?
Because I can tell I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to get through all my slides.
Okay, sure. So firstly, wanting to know what the recourse against Facebook would be. So where someone does have this case of defamation on Facebook, practically what does it look like when they're trying to bring it to Facebook? How likely is it that the post gets removed? I think that they're speaking specifically to certain groups, Facebook groups, and what the admin standard should be in that regard.
So trying to hold Facebook to account is one of the banes of my existence, right? So what happens is that they take the approach that they don't have jurisdiction in South Africa. And if you send them a letter of demand, for example, in South Africa, and you say, look, we've been the victim of, let me choose something extreme. I had a case last year where a 13-year-old girl was receiving death and rape threats from somebody who definitely knew her, because it was including in these messages, it was on Instagram, but obviously Facebook owns Instagram, things about references to where she lives, how they were going to chop up her body and feed it to the fishes in the dam and the estate where she lives. So like very, very personal, graphic descriptions about how they were going to rape her, the most horrific stuff, right? So I go to Facebook and I say, hey, Mr. Facebook, and there are real people here, right? So I'm dealing with people I know work for Facebook in South Africa. Give me the BSI, which is the basic subscriber information, right? The IP address, anything they know about the person, the email address, the device that was used, everything that they know, so that I can take that information, give it to the investigators, and we can try and find out who's behind this account, so we can take steps against them, because this little 13-year-old girl is not going to school because she's going to be chopped up by whoever this person is, right? It's clearly somebody who's at school with her. Facebook says, oh no, we don't have any of that information. If you want that information, we will give it to you, but we need to have a court order. Now, objectively, any person looking at that content would realize that the safety right of a 13-year-old girl is more important than the privacy right of somebody who's abusing their platform. Alas, they did not hand over the information. They said we needed a court order. So off we go to court, spend hundreds of thousands of rands, getting a court order against Facebook so that they hand over our BSI. Find somebody in America to drive to Palo Alto to deliver it by hand, but then there's nobody there because everybody's working at home because it's locked down. Like, you've just got no idea how extremely absurd holding Facebook to account here is. It is outrageous. They have that information, they must hand over that information. Now, you would have seen huge movements this year, particularly in the context of all the racism and the footballers. Big campaigns against these companies to verify the identities of people who create accounts, so that if the account is misused, if that person abuses Facebook's terms and conditions, then they are able to actually find out who is behind that account, right? It is, I think, criminal, to be honest, how Facebook is operating, particularly in South Africa. The idea that they are based here, they make money here, but they refuse to be held accountable in South African courts. There is no question, as far as I'm concerned, that there is jurisdiction. Again, Facebook has jurisdiction in South Africa. They kind of take the approach that Facebook Inc. is responsible for all content, and Facebook South Africa, which is the company that's held here, is just responsible for marketing and for advertising, and has no control over the content. So you know, as you can tell, I'm quite passionate about this subject. It's something I can talk about literally for hours, and I've had many cases where we've tried to get content removed, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. These are my tips. If possible, style a takedown notice as an intellectual property infringement, rather than they're saying mean things about us. Because Facebook is based in America, and you guys will talk about this more, you know, you've got Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the Billboard immunity. It's very difficult to get them to take content down. But my experience is that if you can style it as intellectual property infringement, child sexual abuse, child pornography, or terrorism, then I do find that they jump around a little bit more. And I'll give you an illustration of this. Years ago, there was this horrible shooting at the school, Sandy Hook. And there was a teacher who was killed in that Sandy Hook shooting. And there were these conspiracy theories that popped up afterwards. And she was a hero. I mean, she died protecting these 6-year-old kids in her class. And there were these conspiracy theorists who popped up afterwards and created these Facebook pages, basically saying that she was responsible for the shooting, and that she was in cahoots with the shooter, and that she deserved it, right? So her family sort of sent these various takedown requests to Facebook to say they're infringing, the dignity of the remaining family. This is awful. It's totally untrue. Please delete these Facebook pages. And Facebook did damn all about it. Eventually, what they did was they trademarked her face, the pictures that were being used by these conspiracy theorists, and her name as trademarks. And the day those registrations came through, they served the registrations on Facebook. They basically said, look, these groups are infringing the intellectual property rights of our family, and they took those pages down immediately. It's outrageous. In America, they take property rights much more seriously than personality rights. The whole of the rest of the world really takes the approach that if you have the ability to delete content, you're responsible for it. You're in what we call the chain of publication. In America, if you provide the billboard, you've got the billboard immunity, which is why these companies like to be located there, to be protected by Section 230. Again, much longer explanation than we have time to go into, but I've got no doubt there are more than many competent panelists who can take you through it in detail. I was going to talk quickly about how to respond to defamation. For me, what's much more important than 50,000 Rand in damages in 3 years' time, once I've spent a fortune on legal fees to get to that point, is tomorrow a correction, a retraction, an apology, an undertaking that they're going to stop harassing you, the undertaking that they're going to stop defaming you. So we do see this trend, send a cease and desist letter, make it look almost like a PR release, cross a legal lesson, cross a prayer as in, this is what we want from you. We don't want millions of Rand from you. What we want is to correct it. If somebody writes an article today that Emma Sadleir is a pedophile, or this top advocate who's been arrested in South Africa for all these unbelievably hectic charges, that person is actually this Mr. X, and Mr. X has been wrongly identified. Rather than suing that person for defamation and spending years in the action court, let's just get an apology immediately, right? That's for me much more valuable. And so we saw this when Bonang Mateba there was allegations that in this podcast that she was the one who introduced AKA the rapper to a lifestyle of drugs and drinking and reckless behavior, and that was why Anela Tembe fell to her death out of the Pepper Club Hotel. Completely baseless, completely untrue. She sends a letter of demand, and the next day we get this video of him apologizing, say there was absolutely no basis for him to say this, seen by over 700,000 times in the first day. For me, that's so much more valuable than going off to court, as I say, and spending money. Although she says she still served summons, and she's going to, she's suing him for 500,000 Rand. I think there we sort of get into David and Goliath territory. I know that I'm well out of time. I just want to quickly talk about what I call the Barbra Streisand effect, because it's one of the biggest issues, practical considerations that we have to consider, and that we have considered in the few cases that I have discussed with people who've been victims of anti-Semitism online. And the Barbra Streisand effect is the idea that the more you respond to content online, the more airtime it gets, the more fuel you add to the fire. And what happened was that years ago, Barbra Streisand found out that there were aerial photographs of her house on the Californian Coastal Guard website. And she thought that it was this picture. She thought it was terribly invasive of her privacy. And so she rushed off to court to get an injunction, an interdict to get the photo removed. And at the time of launching the application, they could tell from the information on the back end, the data, that there were 4 people who had seen the content. At the end of the urgent, tens of thousands of people had accessed that content. And it's that idea, that the more you kind of string things out sometimes, and it's an awful thing to say, but sometimes what you want to do is kind of sweep things under the carpet. Maybe it's deactivate your social media accounts for a while. Maybe it's, just go to ground and let it blow over, even when the law is entirely on your side. And that's a difficult pill for a lot of people to swallow. And it really is something that needs to be considered. How much traction is this getting? By doing anything, responding either legally or reputationally, are we going to make things worse? Are we going to add fuel to the fire? So, and as I say, it's a very tricky one. But I don't think that there are sufficient mechanisms to keep a lot of the legal action completely confidential. As I say, if we send a cease and desist letter, invariably the person who receives it will just publish it, send it to all their cronies, and then more people end up jumping on the bandwagon. What I do want to say, though, is that if you are ever in the eye of a social media storm, you can deactivate your social media accounts. And I do think that if you are going to voice your political views and get involved in controversial topics of discussion, you have a duty to protect your family, and you have a duty particularly to protect your children. So if you are going to be vocal, which is absolutely your right, I do think that you need to make sure that pictures of your children particularly cannot land up in the hands of the digital vigilante mob. So if you do share pictures of your children on social media, making sure that there are maximum privacy settings, making sure that you only have people you know and trust in your networks. And whenever the cancel culture vigilante mob hits, the first thing they're going to do is find out as much content as they can of you. And I remember that Margaret van Wyk, I don't know if you remember this case, who sent a picture of her genitals to the WhatsApp group, the Hockey O's of Schwarzer-Reneke. And I only name her because she came out and consented to being named, and told her story, because I think otherwise she should be treated as a victim of a sexual offense, which is, I believe, what she was. And I remember as that story broke, I remember putting in my search engine on Facebook, Margaret van Wyk, and it said at the bottom, 14,000 people are currently searching this, and it had happened literally minutes before. And people had gone to her Facebook page, taken pictures of her daughters, and turned those pictures into memes. There was a meme going around of a picture of her daughters who'd been bridesmaids at her wedding, saying, "Everybody's seen your massa," beep, right? And these poor children get dragged into it. So I do think that we've got to be very sensible about how we use these platforms, making sure we're invoking all privacy settings that are available to us to protect the important family members around us. So I'm going to just zoom through some of this. I have spoken about all of these. Velap Kumalo was found guilty of hate speech. I want to cleanse this country of all white people. We must act as Hitler did to the Jews. He was found guilty of hate speech. This was a crimen injuria case. I'm afraid I can't stay for the whole panel. I would have loved to, and I've taken over my time. I mean, what's it called? Sorry, my COVID brain fog. I've run over time. But those are my contact details if anyone wants to get into touch later. I'm going to stop sharing and come back to the room, and I'll have a quick look at the chat and see if there are any questions. Otherwise, feel free to give me a shout, and I will answer any questions I can.
Thank you, Emma. Tyler, are there any more questions for Emma, or are we good? I can't hear
sorry,
you.
I'm on mute. That seems to be it. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you, Emma, and we really appreciate you coming and chatting with us and giving us such good and such good advice.
Thank you for having me, and I look forward to watching the recording of the rest of it.
Fantastic. Good luck with the baby tonight.
Thank you very much.
Right, thanks very much. And with that, I'm going to switch over to our panel. So despite the negative aspects of online that we've discussed, the positive spin is that this is the medium which brings us a nice international panel tonight. From South Africa, our first panelist is Wendy Kahn from Johannesburg, who has had the exceptionally challenging task as the National Director of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies of navigating us through the onslaught of anti-Semitism experienced in the last few months. From the UK, we've got Daniel Sugarman, who is the Public Affairs Officer on the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and his role includes liaising with parliamentarians and other stakeholders. And finally, our panelist from the US, Dave Sifri, the VP of the Center for Technology and Society at the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you for being here. Wendy, if I can start at home, I would love it if you could give our viewers some insight into the online anti-Semitism that we experienced in South Africa relating to the recent conflict in the Middle East.
Thank you so much, Simone. I'm going to just take a little bit of a liberty, if that's okay, because Emma's presentation was absolutely fantastic. And I think I would just like to contextualize some of that for our community. So she went through issues, you know, when we have, and the majority of the hate that we're dealing with now is online hate. So we've got to decide when it hits that platform, what are we going to do? How are we going to respond to it? So she gave a few, and I just want to give a couple of examples from our community. She spoke about criminal injuria, and that's we have had great successes in using the criminal courts in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism and hate. She did mention that we had the Litswalo case, and that was a really precedent-setting case, and certainly an area that we would very much like to use for other cases. We also have, as you will know, a white supremacist who has threatened our community by the name of Jan Lamprecht, and we also have a criminal injuria case against him that hopefully will be heard within a magistrate's court in the near future. And that brings me to the area of harassment. And we've had lots of harassment in the last couple of months around the time of the war in Gaza, with Gaza. And it's very, very interesting because we've just had a harassment case heard in the Randburg Magistrates Court. And we had a very successful finding 2 weeks ago. So our Gauteng chairperson, Karen Milner, Professor Karen Milner, she laid a complaint of criminal injury against this white supremacist Lamprecht. And he then went after her in her personal capacity, putting photographs, in contact information, really going for her in an unacceptable way. And she took him for that protection order. It's not as simple as Emma made it out to be. It's a very, very complex process. We had to go to court 6 times before we were able to actually get that final protection order. We did have the interim one, but we had to go 6 times. Karen had to sit through court. So it's not a simple avenue, and it's something that we need to think very, very carefully about, particularly since it's an individual that needs to take it. So in other cases, the Jewish Board of Deputies can, in a sense, be a front and an interface with the court. But when it comes to the harassment case, that's an individual going into the courtroom. And it's very inhibiting, it's very frightening, and it's people who are experiencing harassment often find it to be a very difficult process. Thirdly is the hate speech, and Emma mentioned the Kwalani case, but I think it's very important to say that we have our own case who's sitting in the Constitutional Court and waiting for judgment. And we are now going to have to be evaluated according to the new Equality Act definitions, removing the hurtful and evaluating it according to harmful. And that judgment, which we've been waiting now for 2 years, we'll hopefully be getting in the short while. And that, incidentally, that is a case, Masuku, that happened in 2009, just at the end of the Gaza war, during Israel Apartheid Week, when Masuku stood up and he threatened Jewish South Africans. And then the last avenue that we have at our disposal is actually going to the social media companies. And Emma did speak about that a little bit, but if it's okay, is it possible just for me to share my screen? Tyler, is it possible just to give me sharing rights?
Yes, I've made you a co-host. You should be able to share.
I just want to put up one. Emma spoke about what she went through, has been through with Facebook. And this is just one example. This is Facebook. We have many, many different platforms that we have to do similar. This case was during the war in 2014, the Gaza war of 2014. And Phumza Zondi put on Facebook, incidentally, we found out later it was a fictitious personality, so we don't know who is behind Phumza Zondi, actually threatened us, threatened me, rape, a few of us at the board, to be raped and to be murdered. They were going to come and kill us because of what was going on. We then started the process in 2014, trying to lay charges at the police station, the police turning around and saying, what is Facebook? And then we had to go, we eventually went, and it's so great that Dave is on, we went to the ADL, who've got an excellent cyber hate department, and they assisted us in trying to navigate how to deal with this issue. They eventually put me in touch with the law enforcement liaison at Facebook. We had to go to the UK because there was nobody in South Africa who could help us. Eventually, we're looking at August 2014, after having been to the state prosecutor, SAPS, Interpol, the Hawks, Ministry of Justice, State Security, and many others, I was able to eventually find out that I needed to go back to the police station and lay another charge. So back we went to the police station, laid another charge. Then eventually I found the cyber hate department at SAPS, introduced them to the woman now in the UK at Facebook. They eventually managed to get a subpoena and a court order, sent it to the UK, and got a letter back from Ireland saying, you sent it to the wrong people, and we're now going to sue you for sending this court order. So this is the frustration, and it's gone on and it's gone on, and it went on until 2017, and we still haven't, thank God I haven't been raped, thank God I haven't been murdered. But every time we have one of these cases on Facebook, it's not good enough just to remove it. We have to know who was the person who threatened. Was it a serious threat? Was it somebody, just a kook sitting behind it? And this is something and Daniel Sugarman and I both sit on the World Jewish Congress online hate. And this is something that everybody is dealing with around the world. Just to give another example, we have just been, and Emma mentioned it because we did consult with her, we've been dealing with the most terrible cyberbullying right over the last month. We've had businesses targeted in South Africa. We've had professionals targeted. We've had school children targeted, university students targeted by the cyberbullying. There's nothing within the platforms, the existing platforms, to be able to enable us to really deal with it and find out how serious the threats are. I'm going to leave it there, but I thought it was important to bring some of these practical examples of how we in South Africa are dealing with these issues.
Thanks, Wendy. You've really given us, food for thought in terms of where we stand in South Africa when it comes to this and the frustration. I'd love to hand over to Daniel and then to Dave, just to comment on the situation, in the UK and America respectively. Is it any better there? Are there more avenues that one can pursue? Or are you feeling this exact same frustration as Wendy is? If I can hand over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today as well. I would say that within the UK, we're in a slightly different situation, not in terms of the difficulties that we're facing in the online space, because those difficulties are significant and severe and are faced by Jews and people from other minority groups around the world. While I don't wish to speak to the situation in South Africa with regard to your government, I would say that the relationship between the UK Jewish community and the British government is a strong one, in terms of a couple of months ago, when the latest flare-up in the Israel-Gaza war was going on, and the situation was severe in terms of a huge number of threats to the Jewish community in the UK, the Prime Minister held a meeting, the Home Secretary held a meeting, the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Minister, all of them to let us know that they were behind us, that they were backing us, and what they could do to help, essentially, which meant a great deal. Would that the same was always the case when it comes to the social media companies themselves? Because the social media companies, although in some specific cases they will act, there are unfortunately many cases in which horrendous anti-Semitism will take place, and people will report it, and the response will be, we're sorry, whatever this is, it doesn't violate our community standards. And it's it's particularly unfortunate for a number of reasons, obviously. Firstly, because obviously in many cases this is anti-Semitism, but also because many people, if they report something to a social media company and they get that sort of response, they're not going to bother to report similar instances, because if you've had that sort of response, then what's the point? It's a complete waste of time as far as you're concerned. Now, in terms of what we in the Jewish community in the UK have been trying to do, is the government in the UK is currently considering an online harms bill, an online safety bill, I should say, that as part of what it does is meant to ensure that social media companies have to take much more care when it comes to hate speech. Now, many of you will be aware of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which is uniformly praised by all major Jewish representative organizations in the UK. And what we want is for the government has already adopted. There's an organization called Ofcom, which the government, it's the regulator currently for TV and radio in the UK, and the government is planning to make Ofcom the regulator for social media. And what we want is Ofcom to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance when it comes to judging whether social media companies are effectively dealing with anti-Semitism. And the reason we've gone to this, and I'll just take a couple of minutes more because I know we're pressed for time. The reason we've done this is because we have been going for years now to all the different social media companies and saying, look, there are obviously gaps in your community guidelines when it comes to anti-Semitism. I'm sure many other hatreds as well, but definitely anti-Semitism. We see it all the time because you're coming back saying that these things don't violate your community standards. So adopt the IHRA definition, make that part of your community standards. And we hear the exact same thing in a number of different ways. Well, Rome wasn't built in a day, it's an ongoing process. And just this inability in many cases to act. And a prime example, for years, many Jewish organizations, including the one I worked for, begged Facebook to ban Holocaust for years. And Facebook wouldn't do it for so long, for many years. And then finally last year, it was like someone flicked a switch and they suddenly decided, okay, fine, we're gonna ban Holocaust denial. I'm sure that Dave can speak much more on that. I know ADL were front and center in that regard. But it's a really difficult situation. And so we've kind of come to the conclusion in the UK that we have no choice but to have the government involved in trying to regulate the social media companies in this regard, because the social media companies have made it perfectly clear that they will not act in and of themselves unless they are made to by the government. And it's a very tough situation because there are free speech concerns. Interestingly, a lot of politicians in the UK who one might think, okay, we're concerned, you know, we might be going down a slippery slope in terms of free speech. A lot of them feel quite strongly that there needs to be more regulation on this point. And I think that one of the reasons is because politicians, I'm sure all over the world, but definitely in the UK, are particular targets for severe harassment, whether that's anti-Semitism or terrible misogyny or homophobia. And so they are acutely aware of the sort of thing that is going on because they are among the primary targets. Now, I think that I'll leave it there for the time being because I know we're pressed for time, but I look forward to taking some questions indeed.
Thanks, Daniel. Dave, I'm interested in just hearing from you. We heard from Daniel that the British government's response to anti-Semitism was obviously very supportive of the Jewish community. And I've also got a quote from Biden, which said, as a country and a society, he said on Twitter, condemn this hateful behavior at home and abroad. It's up to all of us to give hate no safe harbor. So my question for you is, are these words or are they actually followed up by action in terms of the Biden administration?
Well, First of all, thank you for having me, and thanks for this incredibly important discussion and conversation about this. Obviously, I can't speak for the Biden administration, so I'll just, I can speak at least in terms of how we feel about it and what we've been seeing at ADL and at the Center for Technology and Society, which in a sense you could think of as ADL's sort of Silicon Valley office, right? We deal with all of the platforms. We work in a call-in, call-out strategy with them, and that includes some of the most egregious actors. And by the way, in our most recent survey, nationally representative survey of Americans, 75% of people who experienced online hate and harassment experienced it on Facebook. It is by far, the largest and the most egregious offender here, 24% on Twitter, 24% on Instagram, at 21% on YouTube. And so first off, we have shifted our approach from one where, let's work with the platforms. Clearly, this is an issue of education, that once they understand this, then they'll make their changes, to one that is far more confrontational in our approach around, and also around looking at regulatory and other types of governmental approaches as well. This is a relatively recent shift for ADL, but we believe it's absolutely necessary. And so in fact, if you go to adl.org, you can see we have a plan called Repair the Internet, that actually really looks at, it can't just be a governmental approach, it needs to be a whole of society approach here. But we do believe fundamentally that that there needs to be additional action, including reform on important topics like Section 230 of the Communications Act here in the United States. Without getting too far into sort of beltway politics and the rest, what's clear is that the platforms know that this is going on, and they make, and basically platform by platform, it's a little different, but they take a perspective that frankly benefits their business interests. And what you need to understand inside of all of this is that controversy, polarization, the breaking up, or the argument that occurs, and frankly to some degree hate, ends up driving more clicks, getting more engagement, as they call it, right? So more likes, more shares, more comments. And these are the ways that, they then get more advertising dollars. So, make no mistake that these organizations will say, oh, we removed 95% of the hateful comments before they were even seen by a person. Well, the number of active users on Facebook is larger than any country in the world. They have billions of people who are using their services. So, to argue that these automated processes are handling the problem is a fallacy, and that they need to do more. And making $29 billion in profit last year, it is clear this is not a technology issue. This is not a legal issue. This is a resourcing issue. And that, so one of the things that we did last year at ADL is, when these incredible racial killings, the killings of George Floyd, Breonna, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and others in the United States, erupted in additional, groups on Facebook that were budding to continue this action, racist, horrible action, to go and to kill and make attacks against people, and that Facebook was taking no action. We helped organize the Stop Hate for Profit campaign last year, which brought together not just groups like the NAACP, Color of Change, ADL, Mozilla, and others, but we also brought together over 1,100 of the world's largest marketers and brands and advertisers, because those, quite frankly, are Facebook's true customers, and showed them their level of responsibility, that this is not a question of legality. This is not a question of free speech, right? It's really a question of what are the values that we as a society want to have and to promote. And so if we're going to force change, it needs to come from a whole of society approach where there's regulatory change, but there's also, and there's change from all of us, each one of us, right? When you have a report that is not getting acted on by Facebook or by Twitter or whoever, go to adl.org/report incident. Let us know, because we actually do have connections into each of those different organizations, and we bring these to them, right? It blows my mind that the airlines can lose my luggage and like at least there's a phone number I can call. But yet there's no 800 number when someone is harassing, abusing, or threatening someone on these platforms, and this must change. So in the meantime, this is where our Center in Technology and Society, we spend a lot of our time and energy helping constituents. And I want to make sure that you all understand, and I know we've worked with so many of the organizations that are sitting around this table already, but that we stand at that vanguard and we're ready to hold their feet to the fire in order to see the change that needs to happen. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. I want to pull it back a little bit into the real world of the cyber world. And my question is the following. I'll start with Wendy. Wendy, we noticed in Cape Town in this last sort of in May, June, following the conflict in the Middle East, especially in Cape Town, how the online anti-Israel sentiment quickly translated into the physical world with marches and demonstrations and incitements. Luckily, for the most part, they were peaceful, but this may not always be the case. Do you have any thoughts on how this played out for you and whether you experienced any of this?
Yeah, I think we don't know. And that's why I wanted to share with you my story on Facebook in 2014, because the truth of the matter is we don't know. It might be some little old lady behind her computer who's just feeling very angry or has seen some terrible images and is feeling passionate and is lashed out. It may be that, and it probably is that, and 90% it is that, 99% it is that. Or it might be somebody that's giving you an indication that they are intending to do something a lot worse. How will we know? How do we know if we haven't got access to these forums? And I think for us, what's very distressing at the moment is this case with Jan Lamprecht. We heard it in court 2 weeks ago. The magistrate actually said this. She said, the bottom line is that you say things, you've got a big following on your platforms, a lot of people who are very angry, who hate Jews, who hate Black people, and we don't know what they are going to do with that information. That information can be used to go and really do something that's quite distressing. We do work very closely with the various authorities in government and in the policing structures. And when we do see something that we feel is concerning, we do pass that on. And sometimes they are concerned, and sometimes they think that it's nothing, but I think that, yes, absolutely. I mean, there were some videos doing the rounds that ended up in certain marches in Cape Town. And they were very, very aggressive videos, and there was a lot of incitement in those videos. So we have to take these threats seriously, and we can't just dismiss them. But at the same time, we have to be given access, or maybe not us, but our policing authorities and our legal authorities need to be able to get the access as to who is making these threats, so that they can be evaluated and assessed.
Thanks, Wendy. And Daniel, just from the UK perspective, did you see it playing out in the form of protests and marches? And how did that end up?
Thank you. Yes, we did. So in addition to the online, there was a particularly now infamous episode that I think made its way around the world of well, people who were taking part in a car rally that drove down to London, and a few of the cars that were, I think, part of that rally subsequently drove through areas of northwest London where the Jewish community was, and were shouting anti-Semitic and, in fact, well, horrendously anti-Semitic things. F the Jews, rape their daughters, absolutely horrendous. The police are very much involved in this as an ongoing case. But the reason I bring it up was that the drive itself was something that was organized via Instagram, for instance. So, and obviously the massive amounts of disinformation that were on Twitter in particular, Facebook, with reference to what was going on in that conflict. Something that very much has a huge effect on anti-Semitism towards the UK Jewish community. So the Community Security Trust, which monitors anti-Semitism within the UK, the month in which that flare-up took place in Israel was the highest record they've ever had in terms of anti-Semitic incidents, ever, since they started doing this however many decades ago. So the social media, what happens on social media does not stay on social media, let's put it that way.
Yes, that's really where I was going with it. And Dave, do you have the same experience in the States?
Yeah, you know, there with the First Amendment in the United States, you know, there's a lot of stuff that gets talked about in terms of what the government can and cannot do here in the United States constitutionally. Well, one of the important things to remember, though, is that every single one of these social media platforms are companies, they are corporations. And so in effect, they are considered people under US law. So they too have First Amendment rights, which means that they are allowed to make decisions as to what is acceptable and not acceptable on their platforms. Just as you know, Starbucks would kick someone out if they walked in wearing a Nazi uniform with a bullhorn and started screaming at their customers, these companies have those exact same capabilities as well. So, you know, this is not a First Amendment issue that is used to muddy the waters, in my opinion. And instead, it needs to be looked at in terms of what are the values that they are actually professing, and then how do they live to those values? And that we, as both individuals, as well as companies, as well as citizens, right, have the opportunity to hold them to that. And they show it. Don't watch what they say, folks. Watch what they do, right?
Thanks, Dave. Tyler, I'm just wondering if you've got any questions from the audience, from any of our panelists. And
yes,
I can
definitely.
I haven't been able to monitor the chat line while I've been listening to everybody.
No
so
problem.
Jump in here.
No problem. So one of the questions that we've received is focusing less on from a Facebook point of view and how Facebook responds and how the institution responds, but from an individual response level within our community. We have disparring views, obviously, on topics, certainly when it came to the May conflict. How do we respond to those types of incidents in our community, and what were your experiences in your home territories with it? So with hate coming between communal members.
Great question. Thanks. Wendy?
Yeah, anyone feel free to answer.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify. You want?
Sure.
Sorry, Sadler, if you can just clarify that.
Sure. So we've obviously looked at the hurdles that are faced when it comes to this cancel culture on Facebook. We've looked at how there's the business interests of organizations being prioritized over the harm that individuals might be facing. But moving away from the organization's point of view, more from an individual remedies point of view, what can an individual do when they experience hate? And not only from a specific organization, but it may be from communal members or from peers or from friends on their Facebook. Obviously, there might not be this institutional ban, but from an individual level, how should people respond? What's the best practice?
Well, I mean, maybe I can just respond from our perspective. We were flooded with individual issues. And I think for me, that was how this war differed from, so say, 2009 and 2014, was there was a targeting of individuals. There was a harassment of individuals and a cyberbullying campaign that if anybody, so there was this torrent of information about the conflict. If you dared to hold a position that differed from that narrative, then you were targeted as an individual. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. We had a 6th-year medical student at Wits University, and their university class groups were being flooded with this information. And he turned around and he said, would it be okay if we didn't have this conversation on our class group, but that we had the conversation elsewhere, and that we keep this for class-related matters? And he was mercilessly cyberbullied, and eventually was threatened. They started putting pictures of his wife on the forums. They started telling him, we know your car and we're going to follow you. So we actually went and laid criminal charges with him, because that was an appropriate action in that particular case. But we had other cases with school children who were being, the one school I'm thinking of, the children were as young as in grade 4. And they were being subjected. How does a grade 4 child know how to respond to this kind of thing? So in those cases, we were approaching the schools and trying to deal with it in that way. With the case of the healthcare professionals, it was a different strategy. We discussed with the business people whether they wanted to look at opening a harassment case, and that we would support them with that. They were too frightened to do that. The intimidation was so great. And then there are other ways that we can deal with this. There were some university students where we tried to assist them with responses, so that they could handle it in that way. There was one university student. It was so interesting when Emma put on the Barbra Streisand example. This particular student made a video late one night to defend, in her mind, was to defend what was Israel's stance. And it came across really badly. And she became subjected to terrible abuse. And it started becoming a mob thing, actually, that she was being so harassed and cyberbullied. And in that case, we just told her to lay low. Turn off your social media platforms and just stay low. And she did. And a week later, this too shall pass. So it really is an individual. We have to look at every case. The parents who approached us from Red Hill School for guidance, and our Gauteng chair worked very, very closely with the parents and trying to help them deal with what they were dealing with at that school. But it is an individual issue, and we have to deal with it on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, Wendy. If there are any other questions, Tyler, I don't think there are.
There's one final question that just came through. So focusing particularly again on the May conflict and with our own local community. But Daniel and Dave, if you have any anecdotes that you want to add, please do. But just from a community perspective, again, how do we bring together a community that has disparate views on issues? So the question is phrased as, do the panelists think that we as a community should also be responding to the hate coming from within our own community? So maybe how we nurture those relationships going forward.
I'm happy to talk on this point. Look, I mean, it's a particularly interesting one when it comes to Israel, I think, I mean, I have a lot of family who come from South Africa, and I know that the South African community in general has a very strong Zionist outlook. The situation in the UK is perhaps not quite the same, but again, the overwhelming majority are Zionist in outlook. America, I mean, Dave can speak more to it, but it's become more diluted, I think, in the last few decades. And when this sort of thing goes on, there are cases of unfortunately, of people within the community who will attack others within the community. I mean, it's one thing to criticize someone else's point of view. You know, there's obviously fair grounds for criticism, but when it becomes this sort of thing where it's abuse and hatred, and sometimes something called doxing, which is when someone who has an anonymous account, some other people will go out of their way to try and reveal who they are to the wider world, then that can turn very ugly very, very quickly. And obviously, I mean, I would beg that if anyone takes particular issue with the opinions of other people within the Jewish community, that they attempt to show their displeasure in a respectful fashion, because the number of times, I mean, I've been targeted by it, but you know, people will go, people feel that they can talk. I think everyone here knows, people feel they can talk in a way on social media that they would never ever talk in real life, often. So, you know, people will target you and call you, you know, one of the most terrible insults that any Jewish person can receive, which is capo, or any of the other terms that are used, and it's absolutely horrendous. And it's even worse, obviously, when that sort of thing is being spearheaded by other members of our community. And I don't really know what to say other than, you know, it seems to be a perfect example of the sort of sinat chinam that meant that we were exiled from Israel in the first place.
Yes, I think it's a pervasive problem, and obviously something we could chat for much longer on. I am going. Oh, sorry, Wendy's got.
If I can just comment on that, because I think hate is hate is hate, and just like when whoever is being targeted, we need to, you know, and we've had comments on our SAJBD Facebook page that we have deleted immediately, you know, we're not going. I think it's fine to have discussion, and it's fine to engage, particularly at times when there is such, you know, we need to be able to have those conversations, and we need to, you know, understand and respect both sides of those conversations. And when it does deteriorate, if people are being threatened and if there's incitement to any member of our community, then that's something that we certainly would look at.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Dave, and thank you, Daniel. And I'm going to hand over to Tzvi to say goodnight to everybody and wrap up. Because
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Simone, and thank you to everybody. If I could perhaps just jump in on the last question, and just to say that here in the Cape, we have a campaign which we refer to as the Words Matter campaign, and we're very conscious of the level of debate which take place both within and without our community. And we do become involved, and we do take steps if we feel that that level of conversation degenerates and the rhetoric ratchets up. And as you say, Daniel, it turns into abuse and to hatred. And like in Johannesburg, and I'm sure in the US and the UK, we want to create a space for speech and for dialogue, but make that a safe space. I just want to perhaps conclude. I want to read out the opening paragraph to the Kwalani judgment. It's the Constitutional Court judgment that Emma and others have referred to. I think it is such a powerful paragraph which the judge used in describing what's been the topic of debate for this evening, which is hate speech. And he says as follows: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that to be hated, despised, and alone is the ultimate fear of all human beings. Speech is powerful. It has the ability to build, promote, and nurture, but it can also denigrate, humiliate, and destroy. Hate speech is one of the most devastating modes of subverting the dignity and self-worth of human beings. This is so because hate speech marginalizes and delegitimizes individuals based on their membership of a group. And I think that's an excellent summation of what hate speech is and the effect of hate speech, and why on this call we all take such proactive steps to avoid it. And we're aware that every human interaction has a potential to cause harm. And the only way to insulate ourselves is to withdraw from society. That not being an option, we like to socialize and integrate ourselves. We create red lines. So I wanted to thank Wendy from Johannesburg and Daniel in the UK, David in the US, for sharing with us their wealth of experience as to how those red lines are entrenched and how they're protected, the laws in your various jurisdictions, the steps that you've taken. I think that this evening's webinar has been most beneficial, and I'd like to just thank you for your time and applaud you for the effort that you make. Every victory, Wendy, every success that we have in the courts in the UK and the US is a step closer to what we hope will be a hate-free society. And Simone and her team, thank you so much for putting this together. Tyler and Daniel, thank you once again. And for all of those who tuned in and were very patient with our 2-week delay, we appreciate it and we hope that you have benefited from this. And just on a more parochial note, Cape Town has seen an upsurge in COVID cases. And as I bid you tonight, I urge you all to please stay safe. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Thank you.